I spent it. Those 3 words fell out of my husband's mouth so casually, like he was admitting he forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. But what he meant was our entire nest egg. 20 years of savings gone. I sat there at the kitchen table, my coffee growing cold between my hands, staring at him across the granite counter. All of it? I asked, my voice so steady I surprised myself. Daniel had the nerve to shrug. It's not like you'll miss it. I covered everything. The mortgage, the bills, we're fine. We're fine. That was his way of saying he'd blown through 2 decades of my careful planning on business trips that turned out to be luxury weekends in Chicago and Miami. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, champagne dinners, and women whose names I didn't even want to know. My name is Marissa Caldwell. I'm 46 years old, a senior litigation strategist in Boston, and for the last 20 years I believed I was building a future with a man I could trust. Turns out I was building a fortress for someone else's playground. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the mug that was in my hand, though God knows I wanted to. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye, nodded once and said, "Thank you for telling me. Because here's the truth. Daniel thought he had outsmarted me. He thought I'd crumble under the weight of his betrayal. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, was that I had already noticed the cracks. The secret credit card charges. The extra mileage on his car after client dinners. The faint smell of cologne I didn't own on his shirt. He thought he was playing a clever game. But I was about to show him what it feels like to be outplayed. I met Daniel when I was 26, fresh out of law school and already hungry to prove myself. He wasn't a lawyer, thank God, but he knew how to command a room. He worked in corporate consulting and he had that easy confidence that made everyone lean in when he spoke. Back then I thought it was charm. Now I know it was performance. Our first date was at a little jazz club on Tremont Street. He ordered a bottle of wine I couldn't pronounce and told stories about his clients in New York, painting himself as the kind of man who was always in demand. I mistook arrogance for ambition, and when he leaned across the table and said, "You deserve someone who can give you the world," I believed him. For a while it felt true. We bought a brownstone together. He surprised me with vacations. Napa, Bermuda, Paris. He made everything look effortless and I wanted to believe we were partners building something lasting. But even in those early years there were moments. Like the time I asked about his student loans and he snapped, "Why do you need to know every detail of my finances? Don't you trust me?" I remember the sharpness in his voice, how he flipped the question back on me and how I told myself it was just stress. Or the night he came home late, reeking of whiskey and expensive cologne, and when I teased him about his mysterious new client. He laughed too hard, then changed the subject. Individually they were small things. Easy to brush aside. And I did. Because I wanted to believe the story we were writing together. But 2 decades later, staring at the bank statement that showed every dime we'd saved had vanished into thin air, those small things looked different. They weren't quirks. They weren't stress. They were cracks. And I had ignored them until the whole foundation collapsed. The night after his so-called confession, Daniel slept soundly beside me, snoring like a man without a care in the world. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, every detail clicking into place like gears in a machine. He thought telling me the truth, or at least his version of it, had ended the conversation. But really it was just the beginning. By morning I had a plan. At work my colleagues think of me as methodical, maybe even obsessive. I build cases by tracing patterns others miss, by connecting tiny dots until a picture emerges. That same skill set had kept me ahead of rival attorneys for years. Now it was time to apply it to my own life. I started small. Quietly downloading our joint bank statements, photographing his receipts before he could shove them into the trash, cross-checking flight records against the conferences he claimed to attend. And the picture formed faster than I expected. A business dinner, in Chicago matched with charges from a luxury rooftop bar for 2. A client retreat in Miami that aligned with a weekend at the Seta. A 5-star hotel known more for champagne brunches than board meetings. Jewelry stores in Providence, limo services in Manhattan. Spa packages purchased under my name but never used by me. Every dollar he thought he was hiding left a trail. And I wasn't just following it. I was documenting it. I bought a separate hard drive, one he'd never find, and filled it with copies of every lie he tried to bury. Late at night, when he was in the shower or answering emails, I added another piece to the puzzle. Each file labeled, time-stamped, airtight. Daniel thought he was draining our savings unnoticed, that I'd chalk up the missing money to investment losses or unavoidable expenses. But what he never understood is that secrets are like bank withdrawals. The more you take, the more obvious the hole becomes. And I was watching the hole grow deeper by the day. I expected the evidence to point to another woman. Maybe two. A string of affairs, hotel rooms, overpriced dinners. Ugly but simple. What I didn't expect was what I found buried in the charges. It was a Tuesday night when I stayed late at the office, combing through one of Daniel's travel reimbursements he'd stupidly synced to our shared drive. On the surface it looked routine. Airfare, meals, ground transportation. But one receipt caught my eye. A cash withdrawal from an ATM inside a private club in Miami. A club I knew well by reputation. The Avalon. Not the kind of place for business meetings. More like the kind of place where wealthy men went to indulge in things they didn't want on paper. The kind of place with velvet curtains, discreet staff, and clients who valued anonymity above all else. And suddenly the pattern of expenses started to shift. This wasn't just infidelity. This was networking. Transactions that smelled less like romance and more like leverage. 2 weeks earlier, I'd noticed a wire transfer, $15,000, sent to a man named Victor Russo. The name set off a bell in my head, one I couldn't place until I did a deeper search. Russo had been mentioned in one of the firm's cases years back, flagged for shady consulting work tied to offshore accounts. So why was my husband paying him? The realization sank in slowly like ice water. Daniel wasn't just spending our money recklessly. He was entangling himself with people who operated in shadows. And when you play in the shadows, you don't just risk your marriage. You risk everything. That night, sitting alone in my office with the city lights flickering outside the window, I felt something shift. This wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about survival. Because if Daniel was in business with men like Russo, then sooner or later their problems would become mine. And I had no intention of going down with him. From the outside nothing changed. I still made dinner on weeknights, still kissed Daniel goodbye at the door, still asked about his projects like a dutiful wife. If anything, I was sweeter, softer, more agreeable than usual. Because nothing disarms a liar faster than the illusion of trust. But behind the scenes, every move I made was deliberate. At work, I reached out to an old colleague, Evelyn Grant, a forensic analyst who owed me more than one favor. I told her I needed help cross-referencing transactions tied to a client's husband. She didn't need to know that the client was me. Within 2 days she sent me a spreadsheet that confirmed what I already suspected. Daniel's payments to Victor Russo weren't random. They were structured, regular, purposeful. I started logging everything in what I called my net. Phone records, travel itineraries, photos of his receipts, even screenshots of his calendar when he carelessly left it open on his laptop. Every thread went into the net, tightening around him piece by piece. The trick was to keep him blind. He was smug by nature, which worked in my favor. When I asked casually about our retirement account, he chuckled and waved me off. "Don't worry, I've got it under control." And I smiled. I nodded. I kissed his cheek. All the while, I was quietly transferring what funds remained into an account with my name only. Hidden. Untouchable. But I knew money alone wouldn't protect me. Daniel wasn't a man who simply made bad choices. He was a man playing in dangerous waters, and men like Russo didn't forgive debts easily. So I widened the net. I contacted a trusted investigator I'd worked with on litigation cases, slipping him Daniel's itinerary under the guise of a personal favor. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. And then I did something I'd never imagined I'd do. I reached out to the FBI's white-collar crimes division. Not formally, not yet. Just a quiet conversation with an agent I'd met at a conference years ago. Enough to put Daniel's name on their radar. By the time I closed my laptop that night, the net was no longer just mine. It was growing, spreading, invisible but inescapable. And Daniel? He was still smiling, thinking he had me right where he wanted me. But I was the one setting the stage. And soon he'd walk straight into my trap. It was subtle at first. A glance that lingered too long. A question that felt rehearsed. Daniel had always been arrogant, but arrogance doesn't stop paranoia when a man has something to hide. One night as I closed my laptop, he appeared in the doorway of my study. "Working late again?" His tone was casual, but his eyes searched mine like he was looking for cracks in the mask. "Big case. I said lightly, sliding a file across the desk so he couldn't see what was really on the screen. It was his bank records layered with notes in red. He stepped into the room leaning against the doorframe. "You've seemed different lately. Distracted." I gave him a tired smile, the kind every overworked professional knows how to fake. 46 and still billing 60-hour weeks, Daniel. Distracted is part of the package. He chuckled, but the sound was thin, forced. He didn't push further though, not that night. 2 days later I noticed something odd. The drawers in my study weren't quite how I'd left them. My files, the decoy ones, had been shifted just slightly. And my spare flash drive was missing. Daniel had snooped. He thought he was being clever, checking to see if I was hiding anything. What he didn't realize was that I had anticipated this exact move. The files he rifled through were filled with nothing but boilerplate case notes and a few harmless financial spreadsheets. Enough to satisfy his curiosity. Nothing to reveal the storm building around him. That night at dinner he was unusually attentive. Poured my wine, asked about my day, even offered to do the dishes. A task he hadn't touched in years. It was all theater, of course. His way of probing, waiting for me to slip. I smiled, thanked him, and played my part perfectly. Because in this kind of game, you don't win by striking first. You win by letting your opponent believe they still have control. And Daniel? He still thought he was the puppeteer. He had no idea he was already tangled in the strings I was pulling. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I was in the middle of a client strategy session when my phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. Bank alerts. Unusual activity detected. Withdrawal attempt declined. Account temporarily frozen. I excused myself, heart steady even as adrenaline surged through my veins. I knew exactly whose fingerprints were all over those alerts. Daniel. Back in my office I pulled up the account. He'd tried to move nearly $40,000 from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. He'd even scheduled a second transfer, smaller, almost as if he thought sneaking it through in pieces would keep it under the radar. Amateur mistake. Weeks earlier I'd already shifted our remaining funds into an account only I could access. What Daniel had been trying to drain was nothing but a shell, a carefully maintained decoy. Enough balance to look real but already cut off from anything that mattered. I imagined his face when the teller told him the funds were frozen. That flash of frustration he'd mask with a smile, pretending it was just a banking error. That night he stormed into the kitchen, dropping his briefcase harder than usual. "The bank is a mess," he said, his jaw tight. "Some nonsense about security checks. They'll fix it tomorrow." I looked up from my glass of wine, feigning mild concern. "Strange. Want me to call them? I'm good with account issues." "No," he snapped too quickly. Then he softened, forced a smile. "It's handled. Just a glitch." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. He poured himself a drink, shoulders tense, avoiding my eyes. For the first time Daniel wasn't just careless. He was rattled. And a rattled man makes mistakes. I went to bed early that night, leaving him in his study with his bourbon and his secrets. But as I lay in the dark, a thought pulsed in my mind. The trap was tightening. He just didn't realize the door was already closing. 2 nights after his failed withdrawal, Daniel came home with roses. Not the kind he usually grabbed from the supermarket on his way back either. These were long-stemmed, imported, wrapped in silk ribbon. A grand gesture. "Marissa," he said softly, almost sheepishly as he set them on the table. "I've been thinking about us." I kept my face neutral, though inside I almost laughed. "Now he wants to talk about us?" He pulled out a chair across from me, his expression carefully arranged into regret. "I haven't been the husband you deserve. I've been distracted. Made mistakes. But I love you. I always have." The words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script. I tilted my head, studying him. "Mistakes?" I asked, voice calm. He leaned forward, taking my hand like he thought he still had the right. "Financial ones. Personal ones. But I can fix it. If we work together we can rebuild. We just need to trust each other again." And there was the hook. Trust. His favorite weapon. "What does rebuilding look like, Daniel?" I asked, letting my voice tremble just enough to bait him. His eyes lit with a flicker of triumph. "It means pooling our resources again. No more separate accounts, no secrets. Just us, one team. I need access to everything so I can straighten this out." There was The truth wrapped in cheap romance. He didn't want reconciliation. He wanted my access. I withdrew my hand slowly, like pulling it from fire. You're right, I said softly. We do need to rebuild. But maybe that starts with honesty. His jaw twitched just for a second before he smiled again, wider this time, almost desperate. Of course. Anything you want to know. I stood, carrying the roses to the trash and dropping them in without breaking eye contact. Then let's start with Victor Russo. Who is he? The silence that followed was louder than any confession. His smile faltered, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the panic underneath. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a laugh. I don't know what you're talking about. And that's when I knew. I wasn't just closing in on him. I was cornering him. The next morning I called Daniel into the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and ordinary, but the folder on the table between us was anything but. What's this? He asked, eyeing the thick stack of papers. Your life, I replied. Inside that folder was everything. Copies of wire transfers, photographs of receipts, phone logs, even screenshots of his encrypted messages to Russo. Months of careful work, neatly organized and impossible to explain away. He flipped through the pages, color draining from his face. How did you? You've been sloppy, Daniel. You think hiding affairs makes you clever, but money always tells the truth. And you left a trail a mile wide. He pushed the folder back across the table, forcing a laugh. This doesn't prove anything. You've always been dramatic, Marissa. Maybe you should. My phone buzzed on the counter. I let him see the name on the screen. Agent Morrison, FBI. His laugh died. I answered the call on speaker. Yes, Agent, I have him here. The documents are ready when you are. Daniel's chair scraped against the tile as he stood, his mask crumbling. You called the feds? Over what? Some dinners? Some bad investments? No, I said evenly. Over fraud. Over laundering money through Victor Russo. Over draining accounts that weren't yours. And over the women you bled dry before me. For a moment the only sound was his breathing, fast, shallow, like a cornered animal. Then he leaned across the table, voice low and venomous. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're messing with. I didn't flinch. No, Daniel. You don't. Because at that exact moment, headlights cut across the driveway. A black SUV rolled to a stop outside, followed by two more. Doors opened. Agent stepped out. Daniel turned toward the window, his shoulders sagging as realization hit. The net was closed. The knock on the door was firm, final. Within seconds, Daniel was surrounded. Two agents at his side, another reading him his rights. He tried to speak, to spin some story about misunderstandings and business partners, but the handcuffs silenced him more effectively than I ever could. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the man I'd spent 20 years with finally stripped of his swagger. For once, Daniel Caldwell didn't look like the charming consultant or the confident husband. He looked small, cornered, finished. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of depositions, hearings, and courtroom drama. The evidence I'd gathered, my net, became the backbone of the prosecution's case. Every receipt, every transfer, every message tied him not just to fraud, but to Russo and his circle. The day of the sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Daniel's lawyers tried everything: pity, denial, shifting blame. But the judge wasn't moved. When the gavel struck, Daniel was handed a 12-year federal sentence. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just exhaled, long and steady, like releasing 2 decades of weight from my chest. Afterward, Agent Morrison caught me in the hallway. Most women in your position never see justice, she said. You didn't just survive, Marissa. You outplayed him. I smiled, the kind that comes only when you know you've turned pain into power. 6 months later, I was no longer Mrs. Caldwell. I'd taken back my maiden name, along with something Daniel had tried to erase: my confidence. I moved into a sunlit apartment overlooking the Charles River, traded the brownstone full of memories for a space that was entirely mine. And when I stood at the lectern of a financial crimes conference that fall, sharing what I'd learned about the psychology of betrayal and the importance of following the trail, I realized something profound. Daniel thought he'd destroyed me, but all he did was sharpen me. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't just justice. It's thriving where someone else hoped you would break.